Great. So what we're going to talk about now is resilience. What is resilience? What are some of the myths associated with resilience? And then we're going to talk about the MRT competencies. What builds resilience? What are the building blocks of resilience? That's what we're going to cover. Resilience, myth, and fact, and the competencies that build resilience. So bottom line up front, resilience can be taught. Everybody can learn how to become more resilient, and that we can enhance your resilience by teaching you 6 core competencies that when someone has those 6 core competencies, they're able to respond to adversity and stress in a way that enables them to be effective and productive and have a good sense of themselves and well-being. So let's get into it. All right, I've used the word resilience now already a few times, but let's get some definitions. Well, what do we mean by resilience? So the definition on the screen, resilience is the ability to grow and thrive. Go ahead and circle grow and thrive. It's the ability that when something gets put in your path, when there's a challenge, you grow and thrive in that challenge. You grow from the challenge and you thrive in that environment. It's also about bouncing back. Circle bouncing back. So when there's an adversity, when something knocks you off your course, resilient individuals are able to get back on course. They bounce back to where they were before. So ability to grow and thrive and bounce back. That's what we're talking about when we talk about resilience. And it's built on the set of competencies. We're going to go through each of the competencies together, talk about why they matter. And we know that when someone has this group of resilient competencies, they are mentally tough. They're able to marshal the way they think so that they stay tough and able to handle difficult situations. They perform optimally. So even when they're run down, even if they're depleted, even when they're stressed, they can still perform at the level they need to perform. They're strong leaders. That resilient individuals, when they pull on these competencies, are strong leaders. And they meet their goals. So critical in resilience is goal achievement. You set a goal for yourself, you need resilience to be able to meet that goal. Now, it's not just about growing and thriving, and it's not just about bouncing back. Another part of resilience, something that we see that's in many ways the hallmark of a resilient person, is that they're able to take calculated risks. Circle, if you would, calculated. So I'm not talking about doing dangerous, stupid things. I'm talking about when there's something that needs to be done, and maybe it's going to be hard. There's something that has some risk in it. It's the resilient individual who will put his or her hand up and say, pick me. I'm the guy or the gal for the job. I'm willing to take this risk. I'm willing to put myself out there, because a resilient individual knows that if they stumble, if they fail, they have the skills to get themselves back up again and to persist. So it's growing and thriving, it's bouncing back, and it's taking calculated, necessary risks. That's resilience. All right. Now, before we get into these core competencies, what are the building blocks of resilience? We first have to talk about some of the myths associated with resilience, and then what does the science tell us? So if you look on the screen, or if you look in your binders, you'll see on the left-hand side, we have a list of myths, things that many, many people believe. I certainly used to believe many of them. With things people believe about resilience because they're out in our culture. And then on the other side of the screen, it's, all right, but what's true? What does the science tell us about resilience? So let's go through them. And as we go through the myths, here's what I need you to do. Every time I cover one of the myths, if you believe that myth, or even just kind of sort of believe the myth, put a dot next to it. Because as MRTs, you have to know what your kind of going in position is. What are your beliefs about resilience? And if they're myths, you got to help yourself to get out of that myth and be grounded more in the science. So let's take the first one. The first myth about resilience is that a resilient individual never, maybe circle the word never, never shows emotion. So let me just a quick show of hands. How many of you kind of sort of believe that a resilient person never shows emotion? All right, yeah, I mean, it's fine. There's lots of messages we send in the culture, perhaps messages that are sent in the military that endorse that myth. But what the science tells us is that resilience is not about never showing emotion. Resilience is about regulating emotion. Circle regulate. Because what resilient individuals do is that they are in control of their emotions for the most part, and that sometimes means modulating, not expressing a particular emotion at a particular time, but sometimes it means the opposite. Sometimes it means letting it out, expressing how you feel. And so resilience is about regulation of emotion, not never letting it show. Myth, fact. Let's do the next one. A big myth in our culture is that resilience is only about the individual. Circle the word only. That resilience resides in a person. So again, just think for yourself. Is that how you conceptualize resilience? That resilience is just about the person. Nothing else matters. And if you sort of believe it, put a dot. Because what the science tells us is that, individuals matter, of course. Your ability to stay in the game, your sense of yourself and your own competence matters greatly. But so too does relationships. The most resilient people, the science would tell us, are folks that have strong relationships. They have battle buddies. They have family members. They have friends that they rely on and reach out to when they need to. So resilience science tells us it's not just about the individual, it's about individual and relationships. So the next one is the myth. Resilient people must handle everything on their own. Circle the word must. Not sometimes do, not are capable of, but must. So again, think about that for yourself. Put a dot if that's what you believe, that you're only resilient if you're able to handle every situation all the time. And in fact, if you can't, then there's something wrong with you. Put a dot if you believe that about resilience. Because what the science tells us is that asking for help, relying on others, phoning a friend, relying on your battle buddy, that is resilience. And this is one that I think we have to be serious about. I think we have to rebrand what it means to ask for help. That I think in the culture at large, and probably even more so maybe in the military culture, asking for help is seen as what? Yeah, Sergeant Summerall.
It's perceived as a sign of weakness.
Yeah, it's a sign of weakness. That if you had to rely on someone else, then you're not a real soldier. And so I think we have to rebrand this. That asking for help isn't a sign of weakness. Asking for help is a sign of resilience. All right, so let's do another one. Always act fast. Myth. This is one that I believe. I believe that the most resilient people were the ones that got out of the blocks the quickest. That you could tell how resilient somebody was just based on how fast they responded. And so certainly it's true that resilient people can respond quickly when they need to, when they have enough information. But what the science tells us is one way that we can determine resilience in a person is that we see that person knows when and how to pump the brakes. That when that individual doesn't have enough information, when it's not life and death, so slowing down won't harm, the resilient individual actually slows down. And one of the phrases you might hear a resilient individual say is, gosh, I don't know. I don't know yet. And so I'm going to get more information before I act. So science, resilience is about slowing down when it makes sense to slow down. Let's do another one. Resilience is about accomplishing superhuman feats. That you only get the resilient badge of approval if you demonstrate that you've gone above and beyond what most people would say is humanly possible. And that's a myth. That resilience is about bouncing back. That, sure, sometimes resilient people accomplish superhuman things, but you don't have to have a cape to be resilient. Resilience is about getting back on course. If something knocks you off, you can get back on course. You can bounce back to where you were before and continue to reach your goal. So put a dot if you believe that resilience is only about accomplishing sort of that superhuman feats. Because you got to know what your biases are. The next one. Resilience is about being, circle the word, fully. maybe also circle the word always. That resilience is about always being fully composed. That no matter what life puts in your path, you're able to be calm, cool, and collected. That you never let anything show. So think about if that's your model of resilience. Always composed, grace under fire, never letting anything show. Because what the science would tell us is that resilience isn't always pretty. In fact, I would ask you to scribble down muddling through. Because sometimes when someone is being resilient, it gets ugly. It's not graceful, but you're still sort of slogging through the mud. You're still working your way through. There's still forward trajectory, even if it's not pretty. Science would say that's resilience. You're demonstrating resilience. So put a dot if you believe that always fully composed. All right, 2 more. Myth. You have it or you don't. That resilience is about having a lucky scramble of genes genetically. That if you have that lucky scramble of genes at birth, you're resilient. And if you weren't so fortunate, genetically speaking, you're not, and that's kind of the end of the story. That some people have it and some people don't, and that's the story right there. That's a myth, because what the science would tell us is that everyone can develop resilience, if they want to. Everyone can develop resilience. And sure, there's aspects of resilience that might be a little more hardwired, but there are so many elements, the competencies that we're going to discuss, that build resilience that we can teach, develop their skills. And so if you want the skills and you practice the skills, you can enhance your resilience. So a dot next to have it or you don't, if that's your model of resilience. And then the last one. Resilience is a destination. You get to say, look at me, I'm done, I'm resilient, woohoo, I'm here. That's a myth. That just as it makes no sense to say, I brushed my teeth yesterday, so I don't ever have to do it again. I've got good dental hygiene. Or I did PT yesterday, so I'm done. I don't ever have to exercise ever again. We all know that makes 0 sense. But when it comes to resilience, we sometimes act that way. That look at me, I'm done, I'm resilient, I don't need to tend to it. The science is that resilience is a process, just like physical health is a process, just like physical fitness is a process. You got to tend to these things. You got to tend to your resilience. And we're going to talk in this class about rejuvenation, to make yourself young again, because people who rejuvenate, who take time to refill the tank, are the ones that stay resilient. So a dot if you believe it's a destination, because the science will tell us it's a process. So we got our myths, we got our facts. And as MRTs, we have to make sure that we're out there promoting what the science says is true of resilience and not falling into some of these cultural myths about what resilience is. All right, let's go on. We have our myths debunked. We now know what the science is. So now we have to tackle the question, well, what builds resilience? What are the competencies that if we build up these things, these competencies in people, we are building resilience? So we're going to go through 6. The first is self-awareness. So by self-awareness, we mean being able to identify what you're thinking, being able to identify your emotions. What are you feeling in this moment? Being able to identify your behaviors. It's about focusing on pattern detection. So circle the word patterns in that second bullet point, because part of self-awareness is being able to ask the question and answer, how's this working for me? And if you find that there are counterproductive patterns in your thinking or your behaviors or your emotions, then maybe you're going to want to do something about it. But you first have to be noticing the patterns. And lastly, it's about being open and curious. Often we're more curious about other people than we are about ourselves. So you'll see that the image here is of a mirror. And what we're talking about with the mirror is you glance in. Self-awareness is about glancing into the mirror every now and again. It's not about staring in the mirror all day long. That's narcissism. We have a separate program for that. This is about looking in the mirror and saying, how's this working for me? So here's what I want you to tell me. Tell me how you already, your leaders, your senior leaders, how do you use self-awareness already to be an effective leader, effective soldier, parent, spouse, doesn't matter. How does it show up in your behavior already? Yeah, Sergeant Fisher.
Karen, I think you really hit it when you talked about looking in the mirror. I think effective leaders, if they take a moment to look inside and see where and why have I succeeded, where and why have I failed, and figure out what process they went through to achieve growth, we can share that with our soldiers. We can help pass that on, and it makes us a better leader.
That is such a great example, Sergeant Fisher. So if you're never paying attention to your own growth or struggle or how you overcame things, if that never registers for you through self-awareness, how could you pay that forward? You can't. So asking yourself those questions through self-awareness allows you to pay your lessons forward. Great example. So that's competency number one, self-awareness. Building block number one. Let's look at the next building block, competency. Self-regulation, self-reg. So self-awareness is great, insight's wonderful, particularly if you then do something with your awareness of yourself. And that's where self-reg comes in. So self-regulation is the ability to regulate your impulses, to regulate your emotions so that you express your emotions appropriately, to regulate your behavior so that you get what you want out of life, achieve your goals. It's about expressing emotions appropriately, and that might be different when you're talking to your kids or your spouse than when you're talking to some of your soldiers or a leader. So it's about asking, what's the best way to express myself in this situation? Not being a one-trick pony. And it's about stopping counterproductive thinking. Self-regulation is when you notice your thinking is driving you in a direction where you don't want to head, it's not going to be good for you or for others, that you can stop that train before it gets too far down the track. So we got our stoplight, knowing when to stop, when to slow down, and when is it time to go. So again, same question. How do you already marshal self-regulation in the way that you lead to be effective? Who's got an example? Yeah, Sergeant Thomas.
Karen, in the Army, the news we receive isn't always good. So being able to slow down and regulate your thoughts and your thought patterns will help you be a better leader.
Okay, that's a great example, that if you hear some news, and that news might be daunting, scary, upsetting, self-regulation helps you to think about how are you going to regulate your own emotion and your own thinking so that when you talk about this with your soldiers, you're setting them up for success. Great example of self-reg. All right, let's do another one. So our third competency is optimism. This one is really important. So optimism is the ability, and notice I said the word ability. Optimism is a skill. It's not a personality, it's a skill. So optimism is the skill of, or the ability to, hunt for what is good. Most of us fall under the clutches of something called the negativity bias. And the negativity bias, just kind of like it says, it's a bias towards being negative. That, when you go to sleep tonight and you think about your day, many of us, most of us, when we fall asleep at night or trying to fall asleep, we remember the bad things that have happened in the day. The fight that we had, the goal that wasn't met, the disagreement. That sticks to us, the negativity bias. But what we don't focus on is all the good things, the everyday good things that happened in that day as well. And so optimism is about not denying problems. It's not about denying problems, but it's about saying, all right, that bad stuff happened, but this good stuff happened too. So it's hunting for what is good. And we're going to teach you a whole skill about that. But notice the next bullet point, remain realistic. Please put a big star or circle or something, that bullet point. Because I want to be really clear here, this is not ostrich training. It's not putting your head in the sand. This is about seeing things fully, realistically. And optimism helps us to notice the things that are going on in our lives, that build hope, that we have control over, without denying the problems. It's not about denying the problems. So this is optimism that's married to reality, optimism wed to reality. And a hallmark of that brand of optimism is focusing on what's controllable. So maybe circle the word controllable. Because a lot of times people who are more pessimistic in their thinking spend all of their time focusing on the things they can do nothing about, as opposed to focusing on the things they can do something about. So that's where we're going to put our energy. Optimism helps us to focus on where we have control. It's about maintaining hope, and it's about having confidence, a confident attitude about yourself and about others. And you notice on the bottom of the screen it has a POWMIA flag. why is that the icon that we selected to illustrate the competency of optimism? What do you think about that? Mr. Gross.
So Karen, when we talk about POWs and MIAs and we hear their stories over and over again, a recurring theme is that they were able to maintain optimism throughout their imprisonment.
Yeah. And so being able to control your thinking, I mean, sometimes the only thing we might be able to control is our perspective, is our thinking, and maintaining hope that I will be rescued or I'll find a way out of this situation. That hope, that attitude alone can help people survive. Okay, so the question that you know is coming is, how do you use optimism to be the kind of leader you want to be, parent, spouse? How does it show up already in the way that you are? Yeah, Sergeant Butler.
Karen, going off of what Sergeant Thomas said earlier, you know, we a lot of times get some negative news and negative missions that we may not want to do. The way I look at it and the way I send it out to my soldiers is going to affect the way they carry out the mission.
Great.
So I need to look at it in a positive way.
Great. And so without denying the bad or the problems, but changing the focus from here's where we have control, here's the good that might come out of this, here's the greater good of all of what we're doing, comes from the competency of optimism. And so a big part of what we'll talk about in this course is how do you build the thinking style of realistic optimism. All right, that's number 3. Let's go to number 4. Fourth competency, remember these are the building blocks. If we build these things, we are building resilience, is mental agility. And mental agility is about thinking flexibly and accurately, and I would offer another word as well, thoroughly, that people who are mentally agile are able to think about things in different perspectives, flexibility. They're able to focus on what is true, what is accurate, and they have a whole thorough understanding of the situation. They don't get caught in just one tiny slice or perspective. So flexible, accurate, thorough. FAT. That's my acronym. Get fat. Flexible, accurate, thorough. That's mental agility. So it's taking other people's perspectives. It's trying to understand all the causes of a problem, not just the one that jumps out at you. It's root cause analysis. And it's being willing to try new strategies. How many of us have seen people in our lives who persist in doing the very strategy that's already demonstrated not to work? I mean, yeah, exactly. And so that's not setting people up for success. It's being willing, teaching people by changing their perspective, they can identify new strategies that might work. Mental agility. So, how do you use mental agility? Where does it show up already in the way that you lead? Captain Bombita.
Well, Karen, as leaders, we have to constantly adapt to the changes that we face in the battlefield. And if we are not flexible enough to adapt to those changes, we will not be able to perform the mission as it's supposed to happen.
So anytime the mission changes, which I'm sure happens a lot, then that's requiring mental agility of you to be able to meet the new situation as it is, to change along with what is changing in the environment, mental agility. Great. Next one, strengths of character. Our 5th competency, 5th building block of resilience. And this one is all about the question, what's right with you? It's not about denying weaknesses, we'll talk about that later, but it's about equipping people with the understanding of their top character strengths. Who are you at your best? Some of you in this room, it's judgment and critical thinking. Some of you might be humor and playfulness. Some of you might be forgiveness or curiosity or bravery or leadership. Doesn't really matter what they are. But what matters is that we each know what our top character strengths are, and we think about how do I leverage the best of who I am to be energized, to get the job done, to motivate others. So what's right with me and how can I build on it and use it more? It's about having faith in yourself and in others. And it's about developing that I am strong attitude, which is deep in the Army culture. Strength is about what's right with you, not just mitigating weakness. It's building what's right. So the question is, how do you already pull on some of the top character strengths in you to be successful in your job? Sergeant Lopez.
One of my top character strengths is judgment and critical thinking, especially when we're under fire with the enemy. I have to develop the situation and decide on courses of action to best maneuver my elements so I could keep my men alive.
So Sergeant Lopez gave us a great example of how when he's downrange, he pulls on his judgment and critical thinking, one of his top character strengths, to make sure he's accomplishing the mission and protecting the people he cares about. And that's what we're going to wrestle with in this course. How can you do more of that? Cultivate the best in who you are. All right, and the last one, connection. Just like we talked about with myth and fact slides, that resilience is a team sport. And so the most resilient among us are the ones that have strong relationships. You can't go it alone all the time. And so the competency of connection is about how do you strengthen your relationships? We're going to talk in this class about when there's something difficult that needs to be said, when there's a hard conversation that has to be talked about, how do you do it in a way that solves the problem but also invests in the relationship, builds a relationship? And we're also going to talk about how can you be there for people when things go right? When someone has good news, how can you be there with them in that moment of their good news in a way that demonstrates, I'm really here with you, and it strengthens the relationship? We're going to talk a lot about positive and effective communication. Another part of connection is empathy or tracking. Paying attention to what's going on for the other person. What are they feeling? What's their experience? And a lot of us would argue that empathy is kind of the glue of social relationships. If I don't have empathy for what Shannon is experiencing, over time, Shannon's going to stop coming to me. And so if you want to have strong relationships, you got to work to have empathy to understand the other person's experience. It's about being willing to ask for help, and it's about being willing to give help. Because when you give help, both people benefit. When I give help to someone else, the other person gets my help. And when I give help, I see myself as someone who has something to offer. So it's a win-win. Connection. So last one for you. How do you build connections? How do you build connections to your soldiers, your family members? Sergeant Corbett.
Karen, I think as leaders in the military, it's our job to connect with their soldiers so that they will build that trust in us and bring us their good and their bad news so we can help them through any other issues.
So to Sergeant Corbett's point, if you want your soldiers to follow you, to come to you with problems, you've had to already invest in them, because they're not going to show up at your door if they don't feel that they can trust you. So connection is all about trust. And how do you build that through how you communicate? What questions do you have about what we've covered so far? Sergeant Netto.
Karen, I know you said back on the myths and facts that we have to know when to slow down, but as soldiers sometimes we don't have that luxury. Sometimes we have to make those heat-of-the-moment decisions, so what do we do then?
Yeah, so really important for Sergeant Netto to point that out. I'm not saying, this class is not saying that you always pump the brakes. I mean, you guys know that there are many, many times where you have to act with the information you have at hand. That's all the information you're going to get, and it's go time. So in those cases, you rely on your training, you rely on your experience. But there's plenty of other cases that as soldiers that you confront where you don't have to act right now. No one's going to die. You can slow down, and by slowing down and gathering more information, you might be making better decisions. So this is what we're going to be talking about, is slowing down when it makes sense to pump the brakes, to gather more information before you act. Sometimes you just got to act. Great question. What other questions do you have? Sergeant Corbett.
Karen, also, as Sergeant Netto brought up, you said in the resilience facts that being resilient isn't always pretty. I tend to disagree a little bit, because as you mentioned yourself, what about grace under fire?
Yeah. So that's, I'm glad you're raising that, Sergeant Corbett. We have to be really honest about that sort of distinction between grace under fire, being fully composed. That looks good, and when a person can be calm and composed even under the hardest, most difficult moments, that's great. I'm not saying that's not resilience. I'm just saying let's broaden our definition of resilience. That I'm guessing that most of you have been exposed to situations where maybe you weren't fully composed, maybe there was a lot of emotion leaking out, but you were still able to perform. You were still able to move forward, to handle things, even though it affected you and people saw that it affected you. So what I want to say is resilience is both. Resilience is both. It's about that composure. Sure, we want composure, but it's broadening our definition to allow for the times where you're just kind of slogging through, muddling through. It ain't pretty, but you're still getting it done. That is resilience. Great. Any other questions? Bambita.
Karen, in our line of business, we run into people that just come from a background that is just not conducive towards resiliency. So I'm wondering how much of this we can change in that person and how much comes from genetics.
Okay, so that's important. That in the myth and fact side, I said that the science says that this is something that we can teach, right? That everybody can develop. It's not you have it or you don't. But I don't want to sugarcoat things. Sure, there's a genetic contribution to just about everything we're talking about in this class. I'm a recovering pessimist. So I came by my optimism the hard way. I had to develop and learn it. And so what we're saying in here is, yeah, lots of us grew up maybe in environments or experiences that made some of these competencies a little more challenging. Maybe we just came into the world predisposed towards more of a pessimistic attitude than an optimistic attitude. I don't want to deny that, but even if that's true, there's plenty of space in all of what we're talking about for change and growth and skill development. So if you want to develop these skills, you can, even if you didn't come into this world with them or had an early childhood experience that kind of mitigated it. You can develop these skills. That's what the program's about. Good. Any other questions? Yes, Sergeant Palazzo.
On the myths and facts slides, you hit on how asking for help in our culture sometimes is seen as a sign of weakness. How can we as leaders and MRTs help change that stigma in our culture today?
I think that's a $64,000 question right there. I mean, and I don't have a simple answer. I mean, I think number one, we all have to be asking that question every day. I think number two, we have to model asking for help. I think as senior leaders, if you model for your younger soldiers that you ask for help and it's not a black mark on your record, it demonstrates that you're the kind of leader that this Army wants, I think things will slowly change. I think this program is helping. I think the more we're out there rebranding, asking for help is a sign of strength and resilience, that slowly the culture will change. And that's what we're all doing. Okay, so we've now talked about resilience myths and facts, what the science tells us, and we've gone over the 6 building blocks or the competencies that build resilience. What you'll do next is you're going to start to talk about the 7 skills that enable mental toughness.